Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and I welcome all of you back to another Chris-chan Quickie reading. And this morning, ladies and gentlemen, following everything that happened last night, my voice is still somewhat quite hoarse. It's probably, again, due to I've done like more talking in like the last few days than I have done for like what feels like months at this point. So I'm gonna have to try my absolute best, and well, we will get through it, because that's what I am, no hypocrite. And if this all goes according to plan, then that means that we have got a full 50 days of uploading every single day without delay. So well done for us anyway. So let's get started, shall we, on Chris's hypocrisy. You're all just immature, naive, condescending, soulless monsters. You don't care about others, you only care about yourselves. You only care about getting your own laughs and kicks because you don't have your own social life. The context for this is that when Chris got back from an extreme sports event, and he was deeply upset by his apparent loneliness. Although, once again, from what we understand, this is mostly Chris's fault, and it's of no surprise as to why the way he is. Now, listen, there are plenty of people who have autism, who claim to have high-functioning autism and whatnot, who probably also feel like reckless with misery for an aspect of loneliness. But usually, there are people that do care about them enough in some way, without going too far, that will be sympathetic to them. Besides, it's not exactly as if I've been in this situation before. Well, to be honest, I have. But here's the thing. If the thought of literally being alone was so much a heavy burden about it, then I would have just done something about it. In fact, it's not particularly very... But again, you have to understand, because this is Chris, and because the way his behavior seems to reinforce the fact that he's right about everything, then it's so hard to actually get through to people like him, because someone's just going to straight up tell Chris that his behavior is unacceptable, and if he was in any other situation, he would have been arrested, taken away, or had all rights to the internet literally cut off. That probably Bob should have done years ago, but ah well, what can you do? Hypocrisy is the act of claiming to have beliefs, opinions, virtues, feelings, qualities, or standards that one does not actually have. Chris is an accomplished hypocrite, holding others to standards that he himself does not live up to. And also his expectations are so unbearably high that they are harder to reach than the moon, and Chris still demands people fall in line whenever they address him. As a result of this has led to certain very key instances in which Chris has driven away more people due to the things that he claims to be, but doesn't actually practice. You remember in the incident about too many games when Chris got too hands-on and started touching people inappropriately? And I mention that because, you know what, if Chris claimed to be loyal, caring, free, and not a monster, circa the Little Big Planet video that he did, well, if Chris actually claimed to be, you know, understanding and considerate, then any other person would have just not done what Chris did. But because Chris is Chris and he thinks that sort of behavior is okay in that environment, then no, that's why. And there are loads of other examples, but that's just the big one I can think of at the moment, because people did like get legitimately uncomfortable around Chris, and it was a trait that Chris had been doing for years before. It just so happened in that case, time was catching up with him. Chris is an accomplished hypocrite, holding others to standards that he does not himself live up to. This is probably due to the fact that he's incapable of serious introspection and self-examination, due to his autism. Again, this is more specifically in Chris's case, do take that with a pinch of salt. But on a more self-inflicted level, his ego. Absolutely. Chris believes that he is blameless, holy, and that he is particularly perfect in every single way. However, he sees plenty of flaws in the world around him that cause him stress. Yes, specifically him, not others. Not even others who, well, others that Chris claims to be true autistic people. He blames all of his problems on external factors like trolls, homos, conspiracies of the entire male population. In the past, he's faulted the police, store managers, Mary Lee Walsh, and more security guards for complications during his love quest. When Chris can't be faulted for other people for his problems, he relies on his autism and stress as fallback excuses. Yeah, that's another thing as well about people who are blatant hypocrites, is that they will do everything to bout out of accountability and responsibility. Things that Chris has never really accepted throughout his entire life. He would rather sooner throw everything that most people in society want in exchange for the dimensional merge or just some free pussy anytime. Say that I'm wrong, because, well, what evidence is there to the contrary? He's strongly opinionated and drunk on his E-fame, if that's what he calls it, so he sees himself as a role model that could change the world. To be honest, probably I have a better standing to probably change the world more than Chris, but again, call that what you will. Let's see how well that holds up in a year's time. He doesn't necessarily want to change it for the better, however, but he wants to change the world into one where everyone conforms to his worldwide view and showers him with praise so he never again have to feel uncomfortable, suffer any inconveniences, or be forced to actually put effort into anything. This means arrogantly pointing out the sins of others but never answering to his own. Wasn't there something revolving around Ivy when Chris always criticized Ivy's solitude designs and Chris couldn't bring himself to praising himself, stuff like that? I think that might be the case, but who knows? But it's, again, ironic in the advent of trying to avoid uncomfortable situations or suffer any long-term consequences, Chris has inevitably found his way to all of them because of the choices he made. So, yeah, you can't really say that it wasn't because Chris was the absolute dick that he's always been, but it's that he has proved himself to other people over time that his behavior doesn't change, and because of that, then he's got absolutely no reason to feel bad because he knows fine well he was the result of all this. Chris's mailbag answers are particularly rich sources of hypocrisy, where he readily gives advice to people that he himself will never follow. And as you can see here, there's a lot of examples, so we're going to just sort of go through these pretty quickly because, well, they should speak for themselves and they're very, very obvious sort of what they are. Examples: you grow up. Maturity. You're pitiful, dang dirty trolls, so get it together, move out of your basements. In the latter half of 2009, Chris had become fond of telling his trolls and detractors to grow up. Irony! This was coming from a 27-year-old who had lived his life with his parents continually since graduating high school, has only been employed for 2 months of his entire life, lives in a room full of toys, plays video games all day, and refers to things that make him feel uncomfortable, with childish euphemisms, dresses like a toddler, shits himself, and is dependent on his parents and the US government to point out the absurdity. Or to the point of absurdity. Yeah, I don't really know how to say this, ladies and gentlemen, but when my brother was, my youngest brother was 19 is when he moved out. Only he was moving out because he was going to university in Scotland. So, you know what? He learned to be independent. He learned that he had to look after himself. He had to how to manage his money, how to keep his place clean, how to mobilize and organize his day. I mean, my brother was buying his own clothing when he was 12 and stuff like that. So my brother is very, very independent, and he's very, very proud. In fact, I'm very, very proud of the fact that he's very independent. And to be honest, I probably would have done the same, but again, my circumstances were different because I went to university that was so much closer to home that it was just going to be seen as a waste of money to move out. Of course, times have changed, and, well, yeah, I think there's going to come a point that I should be moving out, I don't want to reach 30 and still be here, is what I'm saying. But we'll see about that, eh? Chris has not moved on past high school. mentally he probably is still very much in the same place. But whether you want to say this is during the age gap for high school or younger, you just put up to your imaginations. In his 30s, he still wears his high school ring, uses his old high school colours in art projects, Crayola Model Magic specifically, and when he wants to portray Native Americans. No, we're not going, not that again, not the Cherokean clan, and keeps his high school yearbook within easy reach. Chris's characters are examples of this as well. Despite ostensibly being 18 to 22 years old, the Electric Hedgehog Pokemon sometimes don cheerleading outfits outside of sexual roleplay and, like him, are rarely gainful in employment. Age 27, Chris dispenses dating advice to high school freshmen, a master of subtlety. Chris named one of his villains in his comics Count Graduon in reference to his much-hated high school graduation. Also, by the way, in case you're wondering right now, ladies and gentlemen, despite the fact that Chris has I think someone said that the total amount of months that Chris has actually been in employment equates to 6 months or less in his entire life. And basically he's like not even had to apply for a job since at least 2009, so 15 years. He's not even had to look at a CV, pick up a pen in order to fill one out, or even bother to type one out. And for what they are worth, ladies and gentlemen, again, it's call it what you may, but it's a good cure for self-pity when you realize that some people work hard for very little rewards or satisfaction, but we're still doing far more and doing far more for the greater cause than Chris ever does. I myself, ladies and gentlemen, have had I've technically started work when I was about 14, but I was just delivering papers. But then I did at least 2 loads every single day by the time I was 18. And I had little part-time jobs in between when I was in university. And then once I left university, I was in full-time employment 2 months after I graduated. And then there was a period between January and July when I was on welfare because of the situation with COVID. And then, ever since at least July 20th, 2020, I've been in work ever since. So, you could almost argue that my amount of employment at age 26 has equated to something roughly 6.5 years, so roughly in full-term employment, if we somewhat culminated all my years of working into one. But again, whether you want to say this is anything to be proud of, or if this is something that is meant to be for or against when talking about Chris, I'll leave entirely up to you, because it's not exactly as if I'm trying to be snobbish and all that about, the fact that I'm proud to be in work whilst other people should be ashamed because they don't work. No, that's not the case. I'm not going to be a hypocrite in that sense. What I am going to say, however, is that people who are on the dole, they do fully acknowledge the fact that you earn far more money through an actual job than you do by sitting around doing absolutely nothing. Chris seems to think this is the opposite case, and that his monthly tugboat, aka his disability payments from the US government, are more than enough to subside Chris's levels of employment, full stop. This, however, doesn't really make much difference, because remember when Donald Trump was made United States president? If Chris really did hate Trump that much, but Chris was more than willing to accept his disability check from the US government. If Chris really hated Trump that much, then he wanted to... Chris would have put as much distance between himself or / herself than Donald Trump in any way, shape or form, from the fact that he was being paid, Chris was being paid out, and also about Chris receiving the stimulus check from 2021, again, courtesy of Trump, which was still going on, by the way, even though Biden was president by this point. But again, that's just probably another example that might come into effect later. Anyway, rant over. In short, Chris idealizes his youth while demonizing the present, as high school was a simpler time when he had a social circle, regular sleep patterns, and some purpose in life apart from playing video games and debasing himself on the internet. Some things never change. Spamming actual hate speech. Get a job - work. I say move on. Get a job, dude, Chris says. Chris also likes to tell people to get jobs while he himself has been employed for about 2 months of his entire life. Okay, I stand corrected. Chris has only been employed for a combined amount of 2 months of his entire life. So, no, I'm not going to fall back on what I've said before. That would just be redundant. A bit like Chris. On his resume, Chris lists playing Pokemon cards with small children as volunteer work. No, that's akin to babysitting at best, but no, that wasn't even the case either. Chris sometimes claims he was supervising or babysitting the children involved, where in reality Chris himself required some amount of supervision not to fuck up the hobby store where he played card games. Much like how he acclaimed author J.K. Rowling went on benefits for a year or two since she'd have the time to write the first Harry Potter book. And listen, that's absolutely true. J.K. Rowling was unemployed for a long period of time, and then... But here's the thing. J.K. Rowling used the time she had to actually do something productive with it. And here's the thing as well. I could rant about employment and money and stuff like that. That's or even the principle of doing things for society in any sense. That's one thing, but it's also another thing when you realize you have leisure. And that's something as well, one of the actual good things that actually being unemployed does give you, is it gives you exorbitant amounts of leisure. Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, is that leisure is sometimes taken on a case-by-case basis, because one thing that is indeterminable is the amount of time you have. Not just whether what time during the day, or specifically put, time you have in your life period. Because whether people like it or not, everybody runs out of time, and no amount of 9-to-5 shifts or 9-to-5 shifts at a job or completely sitting down doing nothing is going to change that fundamentally. A franchise which went on to make her one of the richest women in the world, Chris avoids searching for employment to focus on merchandising Sonichu, a franchise that is only noted for its notoriety and infamy. And that makes an hour or two at most. Chris will draw and colour a comic page or two, make videos, or astonish Charlottesville residents with his parquet skills in a bizarre marketing stunt. Well, it rhymes with stunt anyway. The rest of Chris's time is apparently spent playing video games, watching TV, and downloading extra content for his video games that he never even plays. Chris has an abundance of free time where he could easily work a full-time job and still find the time to draw Sonichu. That is, if Chris were employable. Which, again, that's... Remember when I talked about the Boogie at 618 video, and about how he basically confessed to being the P word, and that a lot of very dubious things that Boogie has done in the past has resulted in a great deal of his records for employment being skewed to very little. Well, Chris is basically in that same field. It's not that they wouldn't be able to apply for work if they wanted to, but it's the fact that there are other factors involved, such as having a criminal record. In addition to this, Chris fails at having some basic skills one would need to keep employment, such as keeping his murderous rage in check, maintaining basic hygiene, dressing appropriately, showing tolerance and respect for other people, and keeping his hands off women. And then, of course, turning up on time, the stress sighing, there's a lot of different factors into this. These buses are full of nutty, slow-in-the-minds - other people with mental disabilities. Yeah, generally I do not feel comfortable associating with other autistic people, especially the non-high functional. It would be like looking through a window to hell to me. And for that, I wish Chris would just straight up go to hell just so we can get on with it, to be honest. But what can you do? He would do a lot of autistic people a great favor, because really, that's just an awful thing to say. And no matter who you think you are. While happily claiming disability when it suits him, i.e. when he gets money and or sympathy from it, Chris gladly reminds everyone that he's a high-functioning autistic. However, Chris distances himself from others with autism, calling them slow in the minds and windows to hell. Chris specifically explained the low-functioning mentally handicapped, the seriously physically deformed, and the autistic high-functional or otherwise, from an actual list of criteria women would have to meet before he would consider dating them. By his own admission, Chris is sometimes the R word. I would say on an average, on a good day, would be 75% to 25%. And that's not including Chris's actual behaviour towards other people. And is abnormally proud that he is on the autism spectrum. In fact, right below his rigorous standards for his future girlfriend, he admits himself he is autistic, but claims that's another story. Not really. It's kind of relevant if, you know, that if your criteria for an eligible bachelorette means that they have to confine to your standards, but you don't have to confine to theirs. What a slimy prick Chris is. Chris denies that any of his Solitude characters are autistic, yet they're all copyright-infringing Little Mary Sues who need to be in the special classes. That Chris fought up and every so often displaying debilitating social anxiety around the opposite sex. Back when Chris made his own Pokemon cards, he fought up an autistic Pokemon named Plautistic, who could disable its own attacks. Huh. But this only appears on the cover of Christian's favourite hits and literally nowhere else. So whether you want to say this even counts or Chris just forgot about it, I'll leave up to you. In the mailbags, Chris dismisses any similarity between autism and Asperger's syndrome, another disorder on the autism spectrum. Chris went so far as to create a specific section for autism-related emails, and then a frothing rant on the Wikipedia, where he rails against those with Asperger's syndrome. The abridged version of Chris's reasoning is that by having a high-functioning form of autism than Chris, they're diminishing Chris's own accomplishments. Couldn't be any further from the truth. And again, if Chris's accomplishments, well, where are they then? Chris considers everything he's done so far special because he has autism. To date, the only things Chris has actually accomplished are graduating from high school and a third-rate community college, which most people could do with little effort. In fact, you want to know how friggin' how bad this makes Chris look? Is that I wasn't really going to mention this, but over the next couple of days is that I'm going into studying once again to earn a business GCSE for the Prince's Trust, so that I can actually get a lot of like channels like these so high off the ground that I might even possibly consider going through the route of trying to do my maths GCSE again, or my history GCSE after 10 years, just so that not only can I pass my history one, but also pass it with flying colours. But who knows, maybe I can actually get my life sort of in a sort of tangible direction by, not so much by retconning the past, so to speak. I don't believe in that for 1 second, but rather we can learn from the past, from things that have happened to us, so that we can try again. That's my logic to it. Something that Chris absolutely will not do whatsoever, but, well, we might get to this. Despite likening the mentally handicapped to reanimated walking corpses, go to hell Chris bases a large part of his identity around having autism. Whether he's triumphing it over being able to mow a lawn, or he's using it as an excuse to sit around and play Little Big Planet all day. Incidentally, this behaviour is actually somewhat common with teenage girls with bipolar disorder, real, self-diagnosed, or imagined. Those sort of things, they sort of describe Chris in many ways, real, self-diagnosed, or imagined, where they'll brag about how terribly bad their bipolar disorder is. I mean, bipolar disorder, bipolar. Listen, for those who for those who don't know, Stephen Fry has bipolar disorder, and you want to know what the truth is that some days, and through Stephen's own admission, he is as happy as you could possibly be. At his worst, however, he is like he describes him. He says he is like as incredibly miserable, and you know what? That's just the case for people who are bipolar. They have really good days, and they also have really bad days. So no wonder people, this isn't something that necessarily should go without saying, but it's kind of interesting about the fact that actually, you know what? I think I would know cases of people where they really go off the handle about how bad their days are, and some days they literally come in with grinning ear to ear. So I know what that looks like, and whether you want to say Chris has this or not, I'm going to almost say no, only because, is this just because if Chris did, he probably would have been seen to about it a lot sooner, but also, what difference necessarily would it have made? It doesn't mean that Chris is any less of a dick to people just because he has bipolar disorder as well. It just means that, well, there's Chris also has bipolar disorder. But again, even people who have bad days can refrain from being absolute assholes no matter what happens. How much lithium they're on and so forth. Most grow out of it by the time they're 18. Inversely, while Chris has repeatedly displayed intolerance of other autistics and special needs folks in general, he has also outright accused some authority figures of discrimination towards autistics due to incidents that negatively impacted him in some way, even going so as far as to machinate a belief that a local school board conspired with a game store manager to ruin his life. Well, the only thing I'm glad to say that there's just nobody believed Chris on that. I'll pray for you to open your mind. Tolerance. Obviously, you have not opened your mind to all things in life, and your religion is a closed-minded one. Chris shortly after condemning homosexuality. By the way, can I just say for the record right now, I've heard that Greece has just legalized same-sex marriage, so congratulations, my Greek brothers and sisters. Thank goodness that you're more open-minded and more welcoming than Chris probably ever would, or probably even still is. It's very much in Chris... Oh, by the way, in case you're wondering, no, I don't think necessarily Chris is as open-minded when he sort of like began to creep out of the closet from 2011 to this day, and I will explain why later. It's very much in Chris's interests that others tolerate him and his odd behaviour. I mean, it basically sums it up right there. Chris's life is defined by mannerisms that can charitably be described as unorthodox. His autism certainly shapes some of his lesser quirks, but he's also picked up some very strange ideas. He thinks it's normal for adults to shit their pants on a routine basis, and he found nothing strange about jerking off into a cup and chugging it down. He once uploaded a YouTube video where he made out with a sex doll with a picture of his sweetheart taped on its face, because he thought it was an endearing act that his sweetheart would want to see. He had a store clerk fit him for a bra that he wears happily. He uses his children's comics to express and explore his sexual fantasies and desires, and to mete out harsh, sometimes lethal punishments on his perceived antagonists. And he's made statements to indicate he's not ashamed of these actions, regardless of what anyone says. So in order to continue to do whatever he wants to do and not be made fun of, he explains these things away by essentially saying, everyone does it and you should still consider me normal. Boo, Chris. No, that's not how that works. Even though he'd probably be hard-pressed to name any guy his age that shits himself as much as he does, well, that and also Chris talks a lot of shit, so it's a double whammy. Deep down, he probably knows some of the things are fucked up, but finds living up to the standards of society to be a huge inconvenience. Or something. So he expects others to change their perceptions so that they can accept him and all of the things he doesn't want to change. In instances where someone might think he's a weirdo, Chris preaches tolerance and insists others open their minds to different ideas and not be so judgmental. the reality is that that just doesn't work, because Chris is such a friggin' weirdo in real life that nobody with half the right amount of judgment or thinking about or inkling would be that open to Chris, because, well, Chris would not reciprocate in the process. However, this doesn't work both ways with Chris. Chris wants people to, exactly like I said, he wants them to open their minds to his foibles. But once he's made up his mind that a group of people are doing things that he considers negative, suddenly tolerance goes out the window, and he will refuse to show them even the slightest amount of respect and acceptance. An example of Chris not accepting others came about during the aforementioned war in his mind being waged against Asperger's syndrome, when a fan mail submission pointed out how stubborn it was to close his mind to documented facts about Asperger's syndrome. Chris refused any consciousness, though in the very next letter he berated someone for following what he called a closed-minded religion, and said he'd pray for her to open her mind. In another example, Chris is sickened by the idea of homosexuality and can't even bring himself to say the word gay, though he will say the word homo, if he's using it as an insult. He's gone on record as saying he hates gay people, is afraid of them, and would outlaw them if he had the power to do so. Also, something about Chris falling for what he calls the straight path, believing that somehow people who are straight are just walking a very thin tightrope. Chris has envisioned a future where scientists have created a cure for being gay, and has incorporated this idea into issue 10 of his kiddie comic strip. The immense hatred burns deep within him, despite the fact that only one supposedly gay person, his elementary school principal, and this is only alleged anyway, had done anything negative to him in life, until Jack Thaddeus began to interact with Chris. Though in contrast, as far as Chris is aware, Jack was also the person providing Chris with freeing hosting the Wikipedia, which at least makes up for some degree of harassment he has given Chris. It was only later he'd been led to believe that Claire Cash was gay as well. He'd stated to Megan that he had these feelings about gays even before he met her gay friend Christopher, whom he illogically suspected of trying to sleep with Megan. Whatever. He simply hates them because they exist, and has refused to tolerate them all his life. Despite his past fervour, he has stated that he does and will not discriminate homosexuals as individual people, and that what they do behind closed doors is none of my business, and I still do not care to know a damn thing about it. Which is why he employs an omniscient being to spy on people and punish them for what they do behind closed doors, which brings us to I shove them up my ass. Homosexuality. While effeminacy is true for us, I feel the contents of that page, the Wikipedia page on effeminacy, is against us, due to it addressing the homos. Addressing the homos as what, Chris? That they are actual human beings? Perhaps? This seems like run of the mill for Chris, but we'll wait and see what that is. Chris is resolute in his beliefs that homos are an abomination before God Jesus, but he does not make exceptions if the gay person has a china. Oh dear, yeah, I mean, of course Chris would say that. Dear me. During an IRC chat, he granted lesbians complete amnesty. Oh, that's nice of him. Saying that if he were in charge, it would be illegal and forbidden to have homo men. Women are safe. Well, that just seems like, that just seems cruel and needless. When pressed on why it's okay for women to be gay and not men, he fell back on his all men are jerks defense by saying, it's bad enough they're mostly jerks, plus homo men are against God's will. However, later in that month, in a mumble chat, he softened his stance on whether or not it's okay for women to be gay by saying he would 100% discourage gay men, but for gay women, he will partially courage. While Chris often quotes the Bible when explaining his hatred of homosexuals, despite the fact that there are also actually plenty of passages that are actually in favor of the LGBT community, and I'm not kidding as well. If you just want one example, just before we go any further, Sermon on the Mount, specifically in Matthew's Gospel, actually read through that and tell me if you can't apply the LGBT community or those who are in the minority in those sorts of fields, because there's a lot to be said about the Sermon on the Mount, not to mention the fact that Chris doesn't seem completely understandable in terms of what it actually implies and why it can't be applicable towards gay people, men as well as women. When pressed about his own abominations, he will go on into a confusing rant about how God only wants people to be happy and not worry about a myriad of rules. In a stunning display of hypocrisy, even by Chris's standards, he is quite adamant to others that he is not wrong in ignoring any Old Testament verses against pornography or masturbation, as the Old Testament is more for Jewish people. Oh my god. But the one Old Testament passage regarding homosexuality that he heard on Family Guy is somehow still valid. You cannot make this up. This entire passage almost reads like something from a throwaway Family Guy episode, and not the one where Brian said that ugly people don't go to heaven. Was that the one that Brian said that ugly people don't go to heaven, something like that? In his essay about his utterly R-word idea for dating education, he claims that homosexual relations are unnatural, despite over 300 species of animals, including bonobos, participating in it. Apparently there is only one species that practices homophobia. Go figure. In the world of Solitude, the villainous Red Naug is gay, but the nanny for Solitude and Rosechu's kids is also gay. She's on the side of good because she's a lesbian, though she's been instructed to keep her trap shut about it. A fan letter confronted Chris with the hypocrisy of having lesbians in the comic, despite his viewpoints and fine Christian morals. While Chris answered parts of the letter, he conventionally ignored that point. Likelier, Chris makes this exception because it would be difficult for him to fap to all lesbian porn he watches and not feel conflicted. He also will make exceptions if gays do voices in his video games. A member of his favourite comedy trope was gay, though it's not clear if Chris knows that. But it does seem clear that whether it's porn, TV or video games, as long as Chris is entertained by a gay person, Chris somehow exempts them from the abomination rule. His hatred towards gays and everything they stand for contrasts very sharply to some of his actions. Chris has no qualms with drinking his own semen, and has said he would even go as far as licking his semen off his beloved. Ew. He's admitted to being plagued by homoerotic thoughts. He loves rainbows and frequently put them in his comics. Chris liked the PS2 game Katami Damacy enough to quote it in some of his video games. A game that features a gay character wearing a flamboyant ensemble that shows off his huge schlong clearly visible through his tights. He once referred to himself as coming out of his autistic closet. He loves gay anthems such as I Love the Nightlife, and listens to music that is also iconic with gay men, such as the Backstreet Boys and Britney Spears. He loves romantic comedy films, and even owns a copy of Sex and the City the movie. Chris also practices cross-driving and shoving things up his ass. That should say enough about the matter. I like the fact they almost say that shoving things up his ass was like that was the clencher. In every sense of the word. In short, many gay men don't act as gay as Chris does sometimes. That's a statement if ever I've heard one. But he still feels justified at leveling his disapproving scorn at them. Yeah, don't expect Chris to go off the handle and start writing things like blue is the warmest colour anytime soon, because, to be honest, I think Chris wouldn't know what that was, or I don't even think he would have bothered to either A, read the graphic novel, or B, watch the film it's based on, or C, his tolerance would be any less, because we know Chris is extremely intolerant. That's obvious. But it's also the fact that he will go off the handle and say that he secretly does like... Now, whether you want to say this is just Chris masquerading for his actual tendencies about what he actually believes in, you're more than free to do so. But unfortunately, for the outside public, it seems he still says he hates them, and that's the sort of thing that sticks out to a lot of people, is that his intolerance. To be honest, if people... So I've known some people just straight up don't bother talking about it if it's something they don't want to be... If they don't want their opinions known about it, because Chris has never really caught on to the idea that you can talk too much about something and then it gives away more than you'd like to let on. But what can you do? If we never knew about Chris, this probably wouldn't make any difference anyway. It's just, if it's what he holds at his heart, then, yeah, you know, the heart wants what the heart wants. No female soul whatsoever. Transphobia. While Chris has requested that people respect his identity, change it after coming out as transgender, he has not demonstrated the same courtesy to another transgender person on one occasion. While under the manipulation of troll character Jeff/Francine, a purported trans woman, Chris used her dead name, Jeff. He also mocked the status of Francine's gender, transitioning, and called her a lady man. Soon after, he used masculine pronouns to describe Francine, said that she was no woman, and mocked the fact that she went through a gender reassignment surgery, while also boasting about his own progress in transitioning, la-di-da, despite the fact that he looks largely the same as he did pre-transition, only growing his hair out and looking more bloated than usual. Whether you want to say that counts as transitioning, well, who knows. In spite of this, the Jeff/Francine example has proven to be an anomaly. Chris will use preferred pronouns and identities of other transgender people, such as the male-to-female Violet4151 and Miss Cherry, and the female-to-male Lucas of the Teen Troon Squad, and no whacking. Yeah. So I think it's pretty obvious Chris will do it just so he can think he could get one up on people by mocking them, whilst that's not really how that works. You thieving imposter, Chris's creations. Jack Thaddeus is wrongfully advertising his fan fiction, and I empathize fan fiction, and parodic Asperchu. Chris, the true and honest creator of Solitude, complaining about fan fiction. Chris is extremely protective of Solitude and the whole media franchise he has created. If Chris had actually shown any originality, this wouldn't really be a problem, exactly, and nobody would be having an issue anyway. He'd have full rights to do whatever he wants with his original characters. As discussed elsewhere, however, Chris has neither the rights to Solitude nor an original work. Fundamentally, Chris's creations are a bizarre maelstrom of various fanfiction elements, with various bits stolen, well, all of it pretty much stolen from a great number of sources. Chris has outright admitted that he steals material from various shows. At the same time, he claims that Solitude is an original creation, and has no problems dictating how people are allowed to use it. In short, he demonizes other works as fanfiction, while failing to appreciate that Solitude is fundamentally fanfiction too. He is unable to see that the fan creations were created through the exact same process he used himself. Chris has sheltered himself from this realization by calling Solitude a parody, but shows no appreciation of other creations which he has labelled as parodies of his own work. One particularly glaring example of this double standard comes in Solitude issue 10. Where Bugs Bunny scolds Jimmy Hill for using Chris's characters without permission. Never mind the fact that Chris is doing the exact same thing by appropriating Bugs Bunny in such a way. Chris needs to be studied in schools, I think I've just decided, about what not to do. Like, what not to do classes and what not. Since Little Big Planet allows reusing certain content, Chris also took a number of completely made designs in Little Big Planet and used them in his own levels, only to tell people not to do the same with his levels, when the policy was changed and all levels were made downloadable and editable offline. Chris should be... I wonder if they thought of this philosophy when they came up with that game, Only Up or something like that. You know the game. It was like The Only Way Is Up. It's where you have to like jump on like various pre-made assets, and you basically ascended to the very edge of space. And people got mad at that because they found out all the assets for that game was stolen. I will video record the whole thing and upload it onto RedTube. Privacy. Daniel Mims knows a lot about me. Who the fuck uses RedTube? That hasn't been a thing since 2012. I have divulged a number of juicy stories with him during our card games. Do not believe his denial of any knowledge or association with me. Chris encouraging people to troll his former friend. In the mailbags, Chris describes Quickville as a place where homosexuality is forbidden by law. This is enforced by Magi-chan, who uses his psychic abilities to monitor all citizens at all times. Offenders are then fined $500. Several days later, Chris used the Solitude comic to rail against celebrity news website TMZ.com for invading the privacy of his electric hedgehogs, who are apparently as interesting and noteworthy as actual celebrities. TMZ was depicted as a floating, all-seeing movie camera that spied on Rosechew putting in a tampon. Sonichu and Rosechew were reenacting a bondage scene from Family Guy, and Robbie Sonny describing unusual interactions with a lizard. This could possibly stem from Chris being unfavorable featured on local news with a video of his. Nor would any other local news station for that matter, but again, we know that. Everybody knows that. Chris also stated during correspondence with his wiki sysop, or system operator, that he would go on as far as to distribute a video of himself having sex with a woman recorded using hidden cameras to prove his heterosexuality. When later pressed on this being a blatant invasion of privacy, Chris covered himself by stating that he would blur the participating woman's face. I think that doesn't go far enough, and upon further questioning, changed his proposal to involve a woman actually willing to participate. I mean, yes, that's just what anybody else would have done, but again, like we've sort of called on at this point, Chris is not most people. He's not even... Anyway. Although Chris originally lost his shit when Lucas and Mims released a candid photograph of him at the gameplays to the internet, he had no qualms about walking into the same store, a privately owned establishment that he had been banned permanently from, and surreptitiously recording an audio conversation without the other party's consent. Chris later spread the audio in an attempt to gain sympathy, missing the irony completely. He later tried to take a photograph of that same person, but was also stopped when he noticed Chris outside with a camera. A little over a year later, he would return to this very store and take more pictures of the man without his consent. With the incident finally ending in his arrest for hit and run, even afterwards, Chris has not learned anything at all. A common theme with a lot of Chris' related material, but there you are. He posted on his Facebook a rapidly taken photo of an angry woman for giving him a difficult time. While eating at a McDonald's restaurant, an employee of Burger King spotted him and acknowledged him, then went to mess with his cell phone. Chris went into panic mode, assumed that the worker was actually a troll, then thought the man was communicating with his own kind by hopping on a form. He then proceeded to photograph the man and talk about him behind his back on Facebook, ironically doing what he feared the troll would do to him. Isn't that funny how that just sort of all works out? He sets me on fire. Slander. Well, to be honest, again, one thing I'll just go into with privacy as well is that it doesn't even stop at the thoughts about Chris doing exactly what he thought other people would do, but also for the fact that, again, Chris has gone on record for touching people inappropriately without their consent, and that's not very nice either. I wouldn't like it done to me. and I wouldn't do it to any other person anyway, so why Chris thinks the need that privacy is only a thing that is entitled to him as opposed to other people is the sort of thing that probably would have led to the birth of guys like Charles Manson, probably. That's my takeaway. It is evident to the readers of Sonichu that Chris uses the comic to settle his conflicts in real life. Every time he felt wronged by someone, he incorporated them into the comic and had his main hero, an idealized vision of himself, beat them up. The main victim of his treatment was Mary Lee Walsh, the Dean of Student Affairs at the Piedmont, Virginia Community College, because she dared interrupt Chris in his love quest on the grounds of the college. Chris launched himself into a ridiculous one-sided feud against her and included her as the main villain in his comic. He gave the same treatment to many people who had frustrated him. This list includes a police officer called in to evict him from a Target store, various store security guards, and managers, romantic rivals, old teachers, and even fellow students, only because they were popular with the girls. This wouldn't be a problem necessarily if it was contained in the comic itself or was used for comedic effect. Anyone free to make an educated guess as to what would guess would say that Chris uses artistic license to overcompensate for his weaknesses in real life. This, however, disregards many death threats he issued to individuals on the net. Jack Thaddeus and Clyde Cash, for example, two well-known antagonists of Chris, were berated without success to commit suicide. In Sonichu issue 10, they throw themselves down a 72-story elevator shaft. Jason Kendrick Howell, the creator of the Encyclopedia Dramatica page regarding Chris's antics, not only received cryptic messages from Chris, but saw his own character left for dead in a pool of his own blood after being battered by Rose Chu's genitalia. Yes, that was a thing that actually did happen, it's true. After a long feud with Liquid Chris, he issued death threats and tried to steal his girlfriend. When this failed, he made a comic of him shooting Liquid in the shins after disarming him. When Casey asked why this was depicted in the comic, he answered that it wasn't that bad since he barely shot him in the legs. Despite literally admitting to it, and the circumstances that led to this. Chris strongly disapproves of this method of expression when he's on the receiving end of it. When he attacked Alec Benson Leary for the creation of Asperchu, Alec had no scruples about putting himself in front of the business end of a flamethrower. Chris retaliated with a long video where he called the attack made on him horrendous, and vowed that the spirit of his dead dog would avenge him. He would later cap off Sonichu issue 10 with a graphic depiction of Alex's execution, but not before mentioning the fiery incident one last time. For, consistency. Or something. While Chris rallies against people making accusations of him on the internet, even those that are true, Chris has no problem accusing others of the most horrible things imaginable. In the Calling Out series, Chris blatantly accuses Michael Snyder of molesting his own daughter. This is in direct contrast with Chris's comic where he illustrates clearly how he's ready to travel in the future and hoodwink his to-be wife into having sex with him. That's just friggin' creepy. If we add a song he wrote and performed describing him in the act of sexually assaulting a black woman, it hardly makes Chris a paragon of puritanical virtues. Sonichu's in the basement. Alec Benson Leary. Chris is not only hypocritical in the rage he feels when someone makes an unlicensed parody of his unlicensed parody, but he believes that doing so is against the wishes of the characters and hurts their feelings somehow. However, him literally taking over the body of Sonichu and dressing it in drag to the explicit discomfort of Sonichu is okay. Or something. Obviously, the entire thing is made up, but it's real to Chris and therefore should still count. And does still count, at least as far as Chris is concerned. Well-informed to expert in sex, women. Chris's hypocrisy is also evident with the astronomically high standards for a sweetheart that he's published at various times in his life, such as on the attraction sign, Some of the biggest offenders are: must have a mid to high salary. Chris does not have a job and wouldn't even know how to make money by himself if he could. Has no prospects for getting a job and lives on welfare checks. Yet any woman he dates must be gainful in employment, presumably so Chris can squander her money on video games and sex toys. Must be average to slender body size. Chris is an obese, lazy slob, yet demands that any potential sweetheart that he deigns to give him the attention to be both thin and cute. Chris does this, and he isn't willing to, throw a bone or anything like that, saying that he will do this, that, and the other. It's all about what he wants, and nothing about what anybody else wants. And Chris still thinks he's not like that, just because he says it. Your actions speak louder than your words, Chris, and you do a crappy job at both anyway, so... Must not have autism. Despite the fact that Chris has made being autistic a huge point of pride, he absolutely refuses to consider any girl with the same condition on the grounds that he fears that seeing them will make him think about what he might be like if he had anything other than high-functioning autism. I would have them escorted, capital punishment. Chris has made it known in his mailbags that he is opposed to the death penalty. However, in the 9th of February 2010 MOV, after the Wikipedia was taken offline, he ranted that he wanted to see Alec, Evan and Mal executed. The implication of this is that serial murders deserve clemency, but people who try to stop Chrissy from stealing intellectual property that deserve capital punishment. Chris later carried out these executions within the pages of Sonnetu issue 10. Hypocritically, he listed off all the ways in which he had been wronged, or the Asperpedia 4 had wronged them. Capital punishment became the subject of 2 videos over the next year. The first video was, "Oh fuck you, Chris," in which Chris showed us that he thinks 20 years of menial labour is a substitute punishment for murdering a woman in real life. This is, of course, 2.5 months after he revealed that he thought genital mutilation via a large drill was an appropriate response to forcing him to stop using a comic character that he had stolen in the first place. The second video was Divine Trial, in which Chris acted out a pretend trial for Clyde Cash, using a Shadow the Hedgehog doll to stand in for Clyde. The trial was eerily similar to the trial of the Asperpedia 4 and ends with Clyde's execution via gunshot for the crime of cyberbullying, although this time Chris also includes that his wife and child would be given to another man, as appointed by the government. I would never do blood and gore. That's just gross. Mature content. Yeah, that's just about... Well, moving on. Chris has severe problems understanding media with mature themes, or to be specific, media with death. It appears that Chris rails heavily against video games that are rated mature or higher, and realistic depictions of death in fiction sadden him. Because he literally does think that they're all real people. Bizarre, I know, but insane as well. Furthermore, Chris has said a number of times in videos and mailbags that his comics will never feature excessive violence and gore. For a long time, Chris took great pains to avoid showing outright deaths in his comics. Jason Kendrick Howell was claimed to be kept alive by dark forces, and Liquid Chris was shot in the legs as a sort of attempt at non-lethal shooting. The deaths of Panda Halo and Ivy were horrific, and were both not actually shown, so it was almost as though Chris was technically keeping his word. Until this part. Blatant outright hypocrisy on this matter finally surfaced in the last few pages of Sonnetu issue 10. He broke this promise in a spectacularly graphic manner. With the court-sanctioned deaths of the Asperpedia staff, Alec and Sean were killed by the electric chair and firing squad, respectively. The deaths of Evan and Mal were particularly severe offenders. Evan was shackled to a wall and mutilated with drills for an indeterminate amount of time before being apparently blasted to death by Wild and Sandy. This included cutting off both of his legs, one of his arms, a series of deep cuts to his torso, and genital mutilation via a giant drill. Mao had his arms and legs telekinetically forced to bend in the wrong directions, causing the snap bones to rip through his skin. As he lay on the ground, Chris telekinetically burst his heart. Chris also has difficulties understanding other mature themes, such as sex and profanity. Chris claims that his comic is equivalent to a TVY7 program, which, according to broadcasting standards, would mean no sexual content or innuendo whatsoever, even if censored. However, Sonichu is loaded with sex, pornography, and innuendo. But Chris says it's okay because he puts stickers over genitalia. Apart from when he doesn't, but that's besides the point. When asked about all of the sex and violence via mailbags, Chris blamed the FCC, as opposed to the person who actually did it, which would be Chris himself, but that's like taking it too far. Chris has stated that showing kids pornography is just a way to educate them on things they're going to eventually see. I don't know why Chris probably should have been arrested for saying something like that, but what can I do? I'm no judge or rocket scientist, but I do know when things are bullshit. When it comes to profanity, another thing people learn from as they become adults. Chris censors swear words, including vaguely offensive words that most kids are allowed to say, such as damn and crap, and scolds others for using them. Sonichu issue 10 reveals that profanity may be a capital crime. So Chris somehow manages to display hypocrisy and somehow insult the intelligence of whatever listeners he had left twice at the very same time. Possibly even 3 times if we're going on the lines of, like, profanity as capital crime. This is going to make my evaluation of, like, the entire Sonichu series, like, a lot harder, because where on earth... Listen, where do you even start with that? Really? I am removing myself from the internet, leaving the internet forever. I really do not like hooking up online, in person or bust for me. On the afternoon of the 21st of March 2010, Chris announced he was leaving the internet for good, with a pompous and bombastic speech about how the internet was trivial and unimportant for everyone involved, and they instead should go out and socialize, and stated that the social networking capabilities of the internet were a stupid fad which was long since over. Chris acknowledged that putting his personal information on the internet was a bad idea, one of many dozens, and promised he would no longer upload Sonichu comics or interact with trolls, online or by phone. He resolved to get the Sonichu comics published and and interact with real people in his community. On the evening of the 22nd of March, about a day and a half later, he uploaded a short video where he claimed that he was still depressed, and then went on to state his disapproval with a new voice actor on Family Guy spin-off The Cleveland Show, and demanded that the old voice actor resume the role. Chris might be excused for breaking his promise to make a video announcing a major life change, like a death in the family, returning to school, finding gainful employment, or even giving an actual apology to a former friend he had offended by his behavior. Instead, Chris chose to make a video simply for the sake of making a video, complaining about something inconsequential that didn't affect his life or many others in any way whatsoever. As well, Chris keeps posting more and more videos afterwards. When he does, he makes the same claim that he is distancing himself from the internet. However, distancing himself from the internet is certainly not the same as leaving the internet. He's still on there, even when he's playing on the PSN. Although he did stop posting videos for a while after Bob's death. He remained active online, most visibly posting to Facebook. That all changed, however, when Chris uploaded a surprise video in October 2014. Now she's with a real man, romantic rivalry. You know my address, right? You got MapQuest to come all the way over? Chris trying to entice a woman to cheat on her boyfriend. One thing consistent in his efforts to get laid is his lamenting of women who are already in stable relationships. He, by default, hates all other men simply because women have the option of being with any one of them over him. When he believes he's found a sweetheart, he's insecure and jealous that someone will try to take her away. And yet, at the same time, he has no problem in attempting to sabotage other people's relationships and taunting former boyfriends. And I apologize because I literally have no choice but to censor this. Yes, his genitalia is censored, but I'm just not taking that risk, so I do apologize. Okay, so let's try and get past this. I really feel offended when they get so flamboyant with their ways. Chris on flamboyancy. When Chris's activities on the Tomboys and Tomgirls of Virginia forum were revealed, it was no surprise to anyone involved that he had gone on one of his usual tirades against homosexuals, saying that it's like homos are shoving their flamboyancy in your face. Consider for 1 minute that on the same forum, Chris had openly admitted that he has recently been using the women's washroom, and even on one occasion had someone complain to him and was likewise shouted at. So not only is Chris cavorting about it in women's clothing in public on a regular basis, he is now taking to using the improper washroom, much to the chagrin of those around him. Call Chris's newfound behaviour what you will, closet homosexuality, a desperate plea for attention, symbolic of castrating himself to subconsciously evoke his frivolity, or getting in touch with his feminine side, as he calls it. Whatever it is, he sure as hell is shoving it in people's faces. What is surprising, though, is how quickly two-faced Chris does get about it. When trying to expose Jack Thaddeus, I should say, he revealed that not only was he transsexual, but also having gone through a sex change and was using it to go after guys. While Chris was supportive of being a fellow tomgirl, he wasn't supportive of the fact that he was going after guys. Again, before anybody says it, and in case I haven't said it already, why any of this should matter to Chris anyway, what people do that don't concern him, you can only hazard a guess as to why. Consider that, because I don't understand either. Consider the fact that at one time Chris stated that he would rather have a sex change than be gay. Thus, to Chris, having a sex change is still fine and dandy only if you're going after China. Bruh. If you're not careful, you really are going to jail. The law. Chris often attempts to get his trolls in trouble with the law, claiming they should be given prison sentences for sometimes completely legal acts that he himself has also committed. After watching YouTube videos posted by Liquid Chris threw a childish fit in which he threatened to call the authorities because Liquid was impersonating him. He, however, had no qualms claiming to be Liquid to try to trick Casey into coming over to visit him. When he found out that Jason Kendrick Howe was dating a girl named Kathleen, Chris accused Howe of statutory rape. As at the time Howe was 20 and Kathleen was 17, either ignoring or oblivious to the fact that several state technicalities might have their relationship be entirely legal. Chris later depicts himself winning the affection of 17-year-old Meg Griffin, for God's sake, Chris, in Sonichu issue 10, which he makes no effort to reject. Chris and his parents have threatened numerous trolls with harassment charges, completely disregarding the fact that harassment is what Chris does best. Not to mention that whatever the trolls have done, Chris's public reactions are far more disturbing, violent, and can legally be interpreted as threats to their subject's safety. Because of his flagrant disregard for trespassing notices, and the definition of what the word banned means, he was to appear in front of a judge because of this. In the third of the calling out videos, Chris has the goal to vaguely tell Surfshark Tito and Forg that the police will catch up with them, right after expressing the purpose of their series, to blackmail the two of them into sending him cash in the next video. Chris admitted that these demands are extortion and retracts them, but in the video immediately afterwards seemed to once again expect the money. You know what, there's a particular thing that, you know, I should just be able to do, and to be honest, it best summarizes like a large part of Chris is literally reading through this. It just makes you just want to do this. Just you know what I mean? It's literally just banging your head against a brick wall. That's what it's like when it comes to Chris. About what seems to be literally everything. We do not like... And by the way, bear in mind just how much we still have got to go. That's just about how many examples and just about on every stance known to man that Chris has issues with. So I hope you're remembering this, because this is going to be on the test. We do not like to stand under one leader, orphantarianism. In the Recalling Ahuvia video, Chris continues to drop info on fellow locale and autistic manchild Ahuvia Horel, the man-woman he believed was Jack Thaddeus, mocking him/her for his/her communist views. While Ahuvia is infamous for his/her admiration of the Soviet Union and for understanding very little of the principles of his/her ideology other than as a framing device for his/her violent fantasies, Chris likewise, as a man-child who does not understand many of the finer points of his own religion other than the bits condemning homosexuality, and believes that the federal government just magically pulls welfare money out of its ass, probably has no idea of what communism is, other than it was the ideology of some people who did some not very nice things in its name, and that some countries that followed it were on the United States shit list at one time or another. Though that's for another story, for another day. This was further evidenced by Chris breaking out the Donald Duck impersonation and singing Der Fuhrer's face, despite the fact that Adolf Hitler was not a communist, and in fact communists, trade unionists, and other leftists were some of the first victims of the Holocaust. That's absolutely true. It's something people need to remember, is that it was what Stalin went after, it was what Hitler went after. He basically almost immediately first went for the trade unionists and everything else that was a little bit more extreme, such as communists, socialists, and people who were liberal towards homosexuality and minorities of that description. Perhaps the most ironic part of Chris's sudden condemnation of orphantarianism is, of course, Cwikville. Yes, everything is named after Chris in some description. And there are no votes to elect a mayor. While Cwikville was at first mostly just Chris's imaginary hug box, with places like the Cwikville Shopping Centre, held in high regard by Chris as his mayoral office is located there, showcasing Chris's naive, mindless, materialistic and consumerist tendencies. However, as Chris conflicts with the trolls escalated, some unpleasant things began to occur. Suddenly, numerous state-funded soup hotels for the homeless began to crop up after the city-state's economic apparently collapsed and left thousands upon thousands jobless on the streets and whatnot. Later on, in particular, during the events of Solitude Issue 10, Chris began to show signs of being a ruthless dictator, with the Cwikville as a dystopian nightmare such as the trial of the Asperpedia 4, who were given no defense, had little evidence of their crimes presented, and yet were found guilty and subject to horrific torture and execution at the hands of Chris and his cronies. While one could argue that Cwikville is simply a harmless child fantasy that has been corrupted by Chris's reactions to the trolls, Chris actually believes that it is real. And given some of his reactions to said trolls, one would do well not to think what would actually happen if he actually had the level of power that he does in the comics in real life. You know what I mean? Look at his slender figure. Obesity. Chris seems to be completely unaware of his own weight, possibly as a result of the self-image he formed over the course of his high school. His portrayal of himself in the comics is often incredibly flattering in terms of appearance. It once got to the point that the irony of him writing a fat version of himself into the comics was completely lost on him. He regularly describes himself as average at worst, and yet he regularly derides others for their weight, most notably in the Calling Out series, where he repeatedly called Alec and Soshak Tito fat. He even had the balls to say Christopher Paul Whitney's fat, "I'm thin," during the outing of Alec Benson Leary in one of the most... that entire video was insane on its own, but just it's one of those things you have to see for yourself to like get a better handle on, because it is unhinged as an unhinged door can possibly be unhinged to the door it's meant to be hinged to. It's possible he might even have contempt for fat people. During his November 4 edits to the Cwiki, he changed the description of Michael Snyder's image to Michael Snyder, the dirty, fat, child-molesting Gentile, adding the emphasis himself. While it might be that he simply does not realize how much his appearance had changed since he was a teen, his constant insulting of other people's weight is a blatant cause of self-contradiction, among other things. Sonic's arms are not blue arms. In 2014, Chris began protesting Sonic Boom due to the relatively minor change of making the famed hedgehog's arms blue instead of their usual fleshy colour. Chris's hatred for his insignificant change is so passionate that he actually got himself arrested for assaulting a GameStop employee. Something completely of his own volition, by the way. Chris was not motivated by trolls or anything other than himself for doing this. After said employee tried to stop him from vandalizing Sonic Boom merchandise. However, Chris is guilty of exactly the same thing, because in his first drawing of Sonic the Hedgehog, he is depicted with blue arms. Furthermore, documents were leaked on the 12th of January 2015, revealing that Chris actually has both versions of the Sonic Boom games. Naturally, he felt the need to post a long tirade on his Facebook and claim Catherine sent him a copy. Whether that's true will probably never be revealed. Worrying Mongoose knows how you feel. Memes. On the 18th of December 2014, Chris posted a long tirade of why he hates the trolls, blah blah blah, the sky is blue, as well as a section dedicated to his sheer anger after playing the infamous Nintendo eShop game Meme Run, and is comparing of famous memes in the game to trolls. However, Chris is guilty of using said memes, because the next month, he posted an image macro featuring Sunil, the mongoose from the 2012 Littlest Pet Shop series, detailing his feeling of worry. Parodies in jest. Maturity. In October 2016, Chris criticized then presidential candidate Donald Trump, saying that he should have taken a parody of himself in jest, when Asperture existed, and Chris did not seem able to do this in one bit because he called himself the true and honest creator. He is very spiteful. Spite. In July 2016, Chris said that Trump is very spiteful. In November, upon Trump winning the US election, Chris reacted by making multiple death threats and prayers. Not just then, but later on. That caught the ire of quite a lot of people on Twitter. Some of which actually legitimately wanted to know if Chris could be arrested for treason. Womanizing and raping actions, sexual misconduct. In November 2016, Chris called President-elect Donald Trump a womanizer and a rapist. In reference to molestation allegations against him, Chris himself has molested several women. And unlike Trump, many of these incidents are well documented. Chris doesn't seem to grasp the concept that women aren't going to be touched by him. While he bragged to Catherine that he's learned to respect women's personal space, clearly a lie, after the Meghan fiasco, he disproved himself soon after by planting his face into her breasts. However, Chris still thinks Trump's sexual misconduct is enough to justify his death prayers against then-president-elect. In 2018, Chris unconsciously kissed people on the cheek at a convention, or non-consensually at a convention. A month later, he went to tell people not to harass him and disrespect the rules and respect the rules of another convention. And his statements aren't the only time he's railed against someone for alleged perverse intent despite his own dirty laundry. For quite a long while, he asserted that his elementary school principal was molesting him, and he denounced the game place for the fact that its owner was a sex offender, even going so as far as to baselessly accuse his then nemesis of being an incestuous P-word. As mentioned, he himself has molested various others and once raped about himself, forcibly stirring children with a woman trying to elude his sexual advances. As for incest accusations, he would later initiate sex with his elderly mother. Don't end up as a full-on super stereotypical spiteful and egotistical male. Kindness. In January 2017, Chris typed out an open letter to Baron Trump. in which he urges Baron not to become a super stereotypical, spiteful and egotistical male, like his father President Trump. This came after 2 months of Chris constantly trying to organize prayers for the elder Trump's death. As for ego is concerned, Chris spent much of this essay whining about how trolls affected his own life. I wonder if Baron ever read that letter, or if anybody just from the post office just destroyed it somewhere else or something, I don't know. If people didn't overspend so much. Finances. In May 2019, Chris commented on an article about excessive spending on public funds by a former EPA chief, criticizing people for overspending. This was only a day after he went to court for debt, as consequence of reckless spending on toys and video games. Chris also bemoaned inflation, blaming it on people getting greedy for the green. Only 3 days prior, he sold a dirty old blanket on eBay for $200, which is only a minor episode in Chris's long history of e-begging to sustain the channel's aforementioned habit of wasting funds on useless garbage. Break your own fourth wall. Dimensions. On November 2019, Chris has made a string of Twitter posts telling people to break their fourth wall in order to interact with the OCs living in their home dimensions. The term OC is what Chris uses to refer to any of the characters found within a cartoon. Chris believes that these characters are all sentient beings with their own consciousness and feelings. Fast forward to a few days later, Chris became enraged when he sees the promo of Pony Life, believing it to be a cartoon along the lines of Teen Titans Go solely due to its art style. Chris began starting rallies against how the show on his Twitter account, spamming both Hasbro and the people who showed any interest in the show with complaints. He even claims that he desires to kill all of the characters with the show itself by having it cancelled. It's been a bit rich, that, isn't it? Can't we just forgive and forget? Forgiveness. Every so often, Chris will do something that serves to bother or even negatively impact those around him, be it loitering in a retail setting to seek out a boyfriend-free girl, assaulting employees of stores he was banned from, engaging in sex with his elderly mother, and so on. Once he realizes he's in trouble and others have reacted negatively to any of his shenanigans, he'll sometimes try to serve an apology to whichever parties were hurt in the situation. Naturally, Chris' feeble and hollow expression of remorse is quickly denied, at which point he is bound to take such a thing personally. A good example would be Chris's recording of an attempt to persuade Michael Snyder to revoke his ban from the gameplays. When Chris's insecurity was at point blank rejected and he was urged to leave, Chris got indignant and pleaded for Snyder to forgive and forget. Ironically, before and after this incident, Chris had been harboring complete animosity towards Snyder and the store itself to the point where he eventually committed a hit and run against the then new owner himself. Even when the case has been taken to court, Chris refused to let go of his unjustified hatred towards Snyder, such that when informed he was to cover medical expenses, as part of a plea bargain to ensure Chris wouldn't suffer from a criminal record, mind you. He openly referred to the very man who had just arranged to make this court easier him by calling him a thieving liar. Even outside of this, Chris isn't really in a position whatsoever to chide others for a lack of forgiveness, considering one of the many things he is infamous for is a tendency to fly into extreme rage against others for perceived slights and or attacks on him, sometimes going as far as to unleash a curse or even desire for them to be killed off. Not just that, but he has even held grudges against the aforementioned Michael Snyder, Mary Lee Walsh and Megan Schroeder, all for things that were his own faults in the first place. It should come as no surprise that even to his magnum opus, Chris will screw up as a message of forgiveness almost immediately after he says it. In Sonichu issue 8, Rosechew reminds Sonichu of the importance of forgiveness, but near the end of the same volume, a single pickle getting thrown at her endorses transformation into the Incredible Lioness, whereupon she brutally face rapes Jason Kendrick Howell in retaliation. And by the way, that's just like, that's part one of all of this. Then we actually have to move on to Chris on his views of hypocrisy. A hypocrite, an adjective. 1. To be of a belief while not upholding that belief. 2. A total liar. 3. An untrue fan. Example, when the Sonichu fan left Sonichu for a newer yet badly drawn thing after having said that they would always enjoy Sonichu forever, is a hypocrite among the truest and loyalist Sonichu fans. Chris on what it means to be a hypocrite. In every sense of the word, even when he's coming up to himself. In the mailbag questions, Chris was asked to define hypocrite. His answer shows that he barely understands the concept. That probably would explain everything we've been talking about for like the last hour and a half. Thinks it's some kind of insult like naive or benevolent, and somehow refers to a fan's level of devotion. Chris's first definition is very broad and can be used to describe hypocrisy, one's stated beliefs being in conflict with one's actions, but can also be used to describe a general lack of enthusiasm. Under Chris's definition, a homophobe who doesn't take drastic measures to eradicate homosexuality would be a hypocrite. His second definition is just hyperbole. In the same way someone would throw around fascist when not using it to describe an extreme right-wing authoritarian nationalist. Kind of like Chris, in a way. Chris's third definition is more of a failed example to describe said hypocrite, and more describes Chris's "if you're not now, you never were" attitude towards fandom. In Chris's mind, he must enjoy all Sonic the Hedgehog games regardless of quality, and wear and display Pokemon merchandise well past an age where that would be considered socially acceptable. Because Chris enjoyed Sonic and Pokemon when he was younger, he's not allowed to move, grow up, and find other, more adult interests. Chris then went on to rail against Asperchu and refused to acknowledge the dozens of mailbag letters pointing out examples of his hypocrisy, double standards, and contradictions. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, if you're wondering, that's it. That is everything you need to know about Chris and on his views on hypocrisy. Oh dear Lord. You know what I think kind of like really strange, just thinking about how all this went? Is that at the end of the day, as far as Chris is concerned, he's not just a hypocrite, he is a malicious hypocrite. Because just as long as Chris can get away with it, or there's nothing physically standing in his way from doing something, then he will do it. And as long as he can get away with that said thing, that is all that matters to him. And it makes you kind of wonder why, to be honest, the internet took such an interest in him in the first place. Because if people knew Chris was really this much of a monster, then I reckon Chris would nowhere near be as popular as he would have been in any other sense, because nobody, what business would people have to interact with someone who is obviously this much of a dick? Nobody, that's for sure. And I hope we've learned something from this, ladies and gentlemen, is that, one, if you're going to say or do something, then you have to follow it through, no matter if you change your mind or you think it's not the greatest idea halfway through. You make your bed and you lie in it. And you shouldn't be forcing your own morals on those who don't share them. So I hope you guys have learned something, and I kind of want to see all of you guys again in the next video. Take care, and bye-bye for now.